I don't think many middle-class Australians really realistically ever think they are going to have $3 million in super. It just isn't going to take.
Hi, Jo.
Hi, Nour.
Hi, Mike.
Good morning.
Over recent weeks, Labor's planned superannuation changes have been in the headlines. That's despite the fact that they were announced more than 2 years ago and well before the election. What's going on?
Yes, I tried to go back and remind myself or discover the origin of this huge fury. And the earliest sort of thing I could find about it was in The Australian. First appeared on page 6, a story about it on the 23rd of April. Remember, the election was on the 3rd of May. It was on the front page a couple of days later when they had some alarming quotes saying how frightening and shocking the superannuation changes were going to be, which was kind of a harbinger of the rhetoric that was to come further down the track. So that was all kind of a bit odd that it almost entirely driven by, I think, first The Australian. Maybe it had been bubbling under in the back pages of the Australian Financial Review, but certainly since then it's been front and centre in the Fin Review as well. And the rhetoric in both those papers and from people they've interviewed has been pretty extraordinary, I think. But it's odd because it does seem to have been almost entirely a media-generated, initially at least, a media-generated storm that has now spilled over into the post-election period as well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we even ran any stories on this in those early weeks of the campaign playing out in other papers. It really seemed quite a peripheral issue. It's only in the last few weeks where it became too difficult to ignore that the other 9 papers and us and others have really dived into it as well.
And obviously it's become a big political issue in the absence of Parliament sitting. You know, there's not a lot else going on in the policy sphere apart from the North West Shelf decision, which we maybe touch on later. But it's kind of filled the space after the election with, as we can discuss, a lot of kind of very overblown rhetoric.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think the reason it's come up now is a few things. One is the sort of practical thing that even though it was proposed and first introduced a couple of years ago, it hasn't passed into law. That will happen in the next sitting of Parliament. So that's brought it back onto the agenda. But as Mike intimated, like, news is very relative. Like, journalists don't always want to admit that. But what is a big news story on one day is determined by what else is a news story on that day. And at the moment, we've got a bit of a policy vacuum. We're in that kind of, well, it's actually been quite an exciting post-election period in some ways, but in terms of big policies, there isn't a lot else around. So it's a very good time for media organisations to launch a campaign on a kind of a pet issue, and I think we've seen that playing out.
Yeah, so like most of you said, referred to it being an exciting time, but most of that has been the coalition tearing itself apart.
The Greens
Green
tearing themselves
Senator
apart.
joining Labor, the Bradfield recount, that sort of politics, not what is the Labor government actually going to do.
Yeah, the fallout from the election. It isn't just columnists and commentators, though. Coalition MP Tim Wilson, who defeated Independent Zoe Daniel, has vowed to fight these changes in Canberra too. Can a campaign from him and the Coalition be effective?
Look, I really don't think so. I think the Liberals have, and I've said this on the podcast before, but I think the Liberals see in this something similar to the campaign they were able to quite successfully run in 2019 against proposed changes to negative gearing and franking credits, which ended very badly for Bill Shorten and very well for the Liberals. I don't think this issue has the same cut through to middle Australia that those things do. Like, middle class Australians, working class Australians aspire to become property investors by and large. I don't think many middle class Australians really realistically ever think they are going to have $3 million in super. It just isn't going to take. I think it's telling that where this campaign is playing most strongly is on the pages of the Australian and the Financial Review, which are, two newspapers that have, a significant sort of readership among the political class and influence there. But, this isn't kind of a hot button issue, I doubt, on commercial talkback radio, for example, or even in sort of the Daily Telegraph or the News Corp tabloids. I just don't think, despite Tim Wilson, I think he's a very effective campaigner for his quirks. He is somebody who can really deliver a message, he's like a dog with a bone with an issue. I don't think this is the issue that he is going to have that kind of success with, though.
Mike?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting when Ted O'Brien was quoted actually in the Financial Review as saying that Jim Chalmers wants to give the impression that he's a modern-day Robin Hood, taking from fat cat investors with multi-million-dollar portfolios to fund good deeds for the government. And it's like, well, that kind of is a little bit what he's doing, like a very modest kind of version of Robin Hood. But I don't think that people would react negatively to that kind of... that seems like quite an attractive proposition to many people who don't have $3 million in their superannuation accounts, I think. So, yeah, I agree with Joe. I don't think they have quite the lines to run on this one that they successfully did on negative gearing and franking credits in 2019. I think the mood of the country is different from what it was then, and the nature of the changes that Labor are proposing are so modest and so aimed at such a small percentage of the population, and the need for changes to the superannuation and tax systems is so obvious to so many people. As Joe said, it's a free fire zone at the moment. They might as well have a go at anything they can get their hands on, and this is the one that's just come to hand. It feels like it's not going to be an issue come 2028, but they need to get something to get their teeth into now and feel like they're doing something.
Mike, as you've alluded to, some of the headlines have been pretty melodramatic, to say the least. One in the AFR said the changes would make Australia uninvestable. Another in the Oz described them as apocalyptic. Given Labor won the election with such a massive majority, does a media campaign like this carry much risk?
For Labor?
For Labor.
I mean, I don't know. Peter Stefanovic on Sky said taxing unrealised gains, which is one of the capital gains, which is obviously one of the criticisms that have been made of the proposal, was putting it under the socialism umbrella, which the rhetoric has just been off the charts. I mean, it's crazy. I don't think there's much risk. I don't think Labor will worry about being criticised by commentators of being, veering towards socialism because they want to tax people who have are in the top 0.1% of the population.
And I think particularly now, I mean, we've just come off the back of an election where this campaign's being run out of two papers that endorsed Peter Dutton, that were very critical of Labor during the last term. This election showed again that the influence of those media outlets, particularly News Corp, has diminished in this country. Rupert Murdoch doesn't just pick prime ministers anymore. The media environment is too fractured. I don't think there is any paper or any media outlet that can claim to have a sort of a line into the Australian public, or that can pick a winner in an election. Politicians have to spread their message far and wide. So I think Labor could pretty confidently feel like they could weather the criticism from these media outlets without it affecting them politically, especially now. I mean, we're only, a month into a term after a thumping victory. They really have very little to fear right now.
Yeah. If they can't weather it on this issue at this time,
it would be extraordinary.
What can they weather it on?
Yeah.
Well, Jim Chalmers has been out this week defending the changes. Do you get the sense that the government will be staring these loud voices down? And I guess to get the changes through the Senate, does that mean negotiating with the Greens?
I thought it was interesting that at one point this week, Anthony Albanese was interpreted as leaving the door open to doing a deal with the coalition rather than the Greens to pass the legislation. That doesn't seem likely to happen at all. There was a lot of talk through the campaign from the Liberals about the so-called Labor-Greens coalition and the threat to that if there was a minority government. The prospect of Labor getting into bed with the Greens has never seemed further away. The hostility between those two parties, obviously exacerbated by the Dorinda Cox switching from one to the other, has hardly ever seemed greater. And I think Labor wants to do everything they can to stick the knife into the Greens almost as much as they do to the Liberals. So it seems much more likely they'll eventually pass it with the support of the Greens. But I do think he wanted to hang that out there as like on other things, maybe down the track, if you don't play ball, we do have that option of going with the coalition in the Senate.
Yeah, I mean, I think as you're about to say, they do have to negotiate with the Greens to get their legislation through the Senate. Apparently there is a path now that Dorinda Cox has moved that they could cobble together a sort of strange cohort of the other crossbenchers, but that seems extremely unlikely. The obvious path for them is with the Greens. They will have to sit down and negotiate. The Greens aren't in a terribly strong position to knock this back, though.
Although they are signalling they'd like the threshold.
Yeah, they're signalling they'd like to lower the threshold to $2 million, and they would like to see that figure indexed as well. Interestingly, that it's them proposing that and not Labor. But at the end of the day, I think Labor could make a pretty strong argument that they have a mandate to pass this. It's been before the Parliament for a couple of years now. And if the Greens block this, side with the Liberals, is that really how they want to start this term of Parliament? It seems unlikely.
And we should say that there are others as well who agree that it should be indexed, like David Pocock, Jackie Lambie, Allegra Spender, I think, has also made that point. That's not by any means an extreme position, and maybe they'll get some version of that through if the Greens insist on it.
I want to broaden the conversation beyond superannuation. When it comes to bold reform, be it on tax or any other difficult decisions that may go against powerful lobby groups or industry groups, how much easier is it for Labor now, given the makeup of the Parliament? And do you think that it will seize the moment and the mandate?
As we've discussed before, they're very unlikely to go beyond what they promised in the election. We saw on the North West Shelf decision, which is the other main thing that's come up since the election, it never seemed likely that they would make any decision other than the one that they did, which sort of left unanswered the question about how it played into their emission strategy, which was technically not the question before them, but all the indications firstly are that they are not going to do anything unexpected. They're not going to frighten the horses. They're not going to come up with unexpected proposals around the tax system. We've seen how hard it is. I guess that is the kind of the purpose, in a way, if you like, of this campaign on the superannuation is to show for the people who are making it and the coalition, I guess, if you like, if you want to do more radical things about tax, about super, to make the tax system fairer and change the super system back to what it was intended for, a retirement income, not an investment vehicle. This is what a campaign against it will look like, and it'll be double the amount if it's actually serious radical change.
Labor did win a resounding victory at this election, but do they have a mandate for bold reform? I don't know that you could argue that they do. They took a pretty modest platform. They played fairly small target. I mean, there are some interesting policies there in childcare, debt reduction for HECS. But take something like housing, for example. There are really no policies there to really tackle the exponential growth of property prices in Australia, which is one of the major barriers to young people getting into the housing market. The policies they took to this election, nothing around negative gearing, nothing around capital gains. In fact, they've ruled out any changes there that would help rein in those big price rises, and instead they're offering more incentives and sort of programs and handouts to help first home buyers get into the market. Now, I don't think that is a very sound long-term strategy. Property prices have gone up, I think, about 40% in Australia over the last 5 years. If that continues to happen over this term of government, the anger around housing, the desire by young people to see action is only going to grow. But will Labor go beyond, will they act on policies that they've ruled out? I don't think so. And I think that politically, their strategy is working for them. In a policy sense for Australia, I think, it's a real worry that we're not going to see them take bolder reform, but politically I don't see them going beyond it.
You've both alluded to the fact that Labor seems likely to continue with this cautious approach. How do you think that will be received by voters who want action on intergenerational inequality, on climate change? How will they respond if they don't see Labor proceed with some ambitious reforms?
I think there were two really interesting seats in the election that haven't been talked about too much, which were Fremantle and Bean, where independent candidates came close to defeating Labor rather than Liberal candidates. I think if the North West Shelf decision had come before the election, they probably would have lost that, certainly the Fremantle seat. So I don't think there's any room for complacency on what you might call the progressive side of things for Labor. No one can ever sit on their laurels in Parliament, and I think that it could be that the majority they have in seats, it proves a bit deceptive in terms of the actual voting patterns.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. And I guess I'd just say too, I think it depends what happens with the coalition from here. What they decide to do on, say, issues like climate change, obviously there's a bit of a reckoning happening there at the moment, will determine how people assess Labor. Like if the coalition continues to be very divided on action on climate change, it probably gives Labor a lot of room, I sort of hate to say it, to continue to kind of walk both sides of the street in approving projects like this while pursuing net zero. At the end of the day, it's even with the rise of the independents, we're largely in a two-party system. And so Labor is really being given a lot of cover on a lot of issues by the fact that the Liberals have had so little to offer on key questions like climate change and housing. But if they become more competitive, if they can start speaking to younger voters on those issues, that could really change things.
Okay, now it's time for what we can't get out of our heads. Jo, what's it for you?
So for me, it's a show rather than a story this week, if that's allowed. And that is the most recent Australian season of Alone has come to an end. This is a show that I resisted watching for the first couple of years when my partner was very interested in it because I thought it sounded bleak. It's where they basically throw 10 people into the wilderness with only a small set of supplies. They have to survive out there, and the last person standing is the winner of the show. I thought it sounded horrendous. Like, why would I want to spend my nights watching someone shivering and starving on a beach in Tasmania? It is the most riveting, life-affirming television about having a sort of a relationship with yourself about what it takes to survive. You become so invested in these people. It's a global franchise as well. And I think it's really interesting that the American and some of the European series get geared more towards sort of almost MAGA hunting types out there who are there to sort of conquer and catch large game animals and things like that. The Australian series has always skewed much more towards environmentalists. Kind of the first season was famously won by this terrific Australian hippie, Gina Chick, who's now a wonderful writer. It's just a beautiful show and I'm really sad it's over.
Mike, speaking of Tasmanian beaches.
This was exactly what I was going to say. Yes, Tasmanian beaches, big in the news this week. We and others reported on a woman who was walking along a beach near Strahan on the west coast of Tasmania and found an amazing fish, an oarfish. They grow to up to 8 metres long. They normally live in the depths of the ocean, so they're rarely seen either dead or alive. But he was one washed up. It's also known as the doomsday fish for that reason, that we don't see them very often, so when they come up, the legends attached to them that, this must mean something. Our readers absolutely love a doomsday fish. They could not get enough of the story, and it looks amazing. And I also really like the description of how oarfish survive. They basically this enormously long, thin fish. It was described as really lazy by one of the experts we interviewed because they basically just hang in the middle of the water and wait for food to drop into their mouths, which, I mean, maybe there's a lesson for all of us in that.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty ominous, the line that read that some legends and stories consider the animals to be harbingers of disaster. So, yes, great news.
Cheery.
Everyone's is waiting for a harbinger of disaster at the moment, it feels like.